Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Ritchie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Training and Outreach Coordinator with Clackamas Women's Services, which is the domestic violence and sexual assault community-based agency in Clackamas County. Today, we're going to be talking about the dynamics of stalking. This curriculum is adapted from Spark's public awareness training, and we're going to be going over a variety of topics relating to stalking. So first and foremost, we'll kind of go over the basics about what different types of behaviors makes up stalking. We're going to talk briefly about statistics, some stalking in the media and how it's portrayed, and how it impacts the way we think about stalking and how we work with stalking survivors. And then we are going to end today on safety planning and how we can better support survivors who are experiencing stalking. I would like to encourage you all to take care of yourselves throughout this webinar. If you need to take a break, step away and come back, that is absolutely fine. So please take care of yourself throughout today's webinar. So what is stalking? We define stalking as a pattern of unwanted attention, harassment, contact, or any other behavior. It's a pretty simple definition. And some key points that we want to include is that it is directed at a specific person and would cause someone to feel fear for the safety of themselves or others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So while this is a fairly simple definition, we'll kind of break down it piece by piece to give a little bit more context. Oregon law has a little bit more specific definition for what stalking is, but it does align up pretty well with what we have as a community-based definition. So Oregon law says that the person knowingly alarms or coerces another person or a member of that person's immediate family or household by engaging in repeated and unwanted contact with the other person. The person who is stalking, it is objectively reasonable for a person to find that behavior in the victim's situation to have been alarmed or coerced by the contact. And the unwanted and repeated contact causes the victim reasonable apprehension regarding the personal safety of the victim or the member of the victim's immediate family or household. Some things I would like to note throughout this is that like when we are having a community-based definition, we tend to leave out words like reasonable when discussing the fear or apprehension that a person may feel because of these behaviors. The term reasonable is really subjective, and ultimately it's determined by each person who's viewing the definition. And so intentionally or not, this can exclude people in society that society has deemed quote unquote unreasonable. Specifically, there's been a long history of women being labeled as unreasonable, hysterical. There's lots of other stigma around substance use and other marginalized communities that may be deemed less reasonable by society. So when we are thinking about definitions like these, we really want to call out that this might not be the most accessible or inclusive definition. And as a community-based agency, we really want to highlight that we are meeting survivors where they're at. And if they're telling us that they're experiencing stalking, that we're coming from a place of belief. We don't want to also play into that misconception that folks may be reasonable or unreasonable, because everyone, regardless of our opinions about their reasoning, has the right to determine what is uncomfortable or scary to them. So really following survivors' lead in that. It is really important, though, that what I like to pull out of this definition is that the survivor is alarmed or they are coerced by the contact. The stalking behaviors are eliciting a feeling of fear, and that they are feeling that they are at risk of harm or in danger for themselves or their loved ones. Importantly, stalking is a pattern of behavior. It is not a single or one-off incident, which makes stalking a little bit unique when we think, comparing to things like domestic violence or sexual assault. This doesn't mean that a single or one-off event can't be scary or distressing to a person. It's just that the definition of stalking requires more than one incident, and legally, it might require more than one incident. However, A single incident might be a red flag that stalking behavior is about to begin potentially. Some states or government departments, things like that, might call it a course of conduct instead of a pattern. So thinking about based on where you're at, that might look a little bit different. To the left, we have a calendar with different little icons. And this is really just to highlight that there are different behaviors that might be happening on different days that make up the pattern of stalking. So we're going to get more into those specific behaviors that the stalkers may be using. But as we see kind of in this little demographic or graphic, is that we might have like on numerous phone calls one day, and then the next day there might be gifts left at the door, things like that. So it doesn't have to be one specific behavior all of the time, but it can be a combination of behaviors happening over time. Stalking is also directed at one person. The perpetrator is ultimately looking to have control over one specific person. Some of the behavior may include other people, but it ultimately comes back to that one person. So, for instance, if a perpetrator is following someone, they might also follow that survivor's mom around, but the point isn't really to get information about the mom or to target the mom. It's really to figure out more information about the survivor that they are directed the behavior at. And once they get whatever information they are seeking from following their mom, they most likely will leave the mom alone. So it really is directed at one person, but we certainly can see how stalking behaviors impact the loved ones around the person who's experiencing the stalking. So impacts, the whole family, the whole household, and the victim's whole community. Ultimately, context is really important. A lot of behaviors that are often involved in stalking can seem completely innocuous. For example, a common behavior they might think of is knowing where the person is all the time. And within a normal relationship, whether that's or healthy relationship, romantic, platonic, what have you, that might not be inherently an unhealthy thing to pretty consistently know where your partner's at, for example. Many people might have that locations shared, for example, for safety reasons. But it's important for us to kind of feel out how a person feels who's experiencing the behaviors. So if it's non-consensual, tracking of that person's location, things like that, things that are causing distress for the survivor, that context is leading us to feel that this person's experiencing stalking. We have to look at what is happening, how it's happening, and how it's impacting the survivor. Also, we know that a lot of the behaviors that a person who is using stalking tactics to have control over a survivor might be really specific to the survivor. We'll talk more later about how frequently perpetrators are known to the survivors, but oftentimes, majority of the time, perpetrators know the survivor in some way or another. And particularly if they're former intimate partners, for example, they probably have a lot of information about the survivor. And so the behaviors the stalker is using may not necessarily seem scary to us as third parties, but might really indicate something insidious for the survivor. So that context is really key. And so we want to be aware of that. On the screen, we have some quotes from stalking victims that reflecting on their experience. So considering the context, we might want to think outside of the box about what language survivors might be using. It's not always going to be, I'm scared or I'm frightened. It might look like, I just want to be left alone, or it's been a nightmare. Some folks might say, like, my entire life has been stolen from me. So they might not be identifying, as we see with survivors of other forms of violence, they might not be identifying the behaviors that are being directed towards them as stalking. They most likely aren't going to come to us as service providers and say, I'm experiencing stalking. Can you help me? They probably will have some other different types of language. And when we hear survivors saying things like, It feels like my life's been stolen from me. I just want to be left alone. That might be a cue for us to begin to ask more questions about what's going on in that survivor's life and how we can support them. To kind of sum up stalking as like over a 360 view before we get more into behaviors. Um, if what's happening is not the first incident, is directed at the same person, and is alarming, scary, or distressing, it could be stalking. And it specifically, if it's alarming, scary, or distressing to that person who is experiencing the behaviors, this could be stalking, and this person might need some extra support. So Spark kind of breaks down stalking behaviors into 4 different sections. The first bucket of behaviors is surveillance. The second is life invasion, intimidation, and interference. A lot of these have a good bit of overlap, um, but it kind of helps us break down that stalking is more than just like watching and following, which we might, initially think about with stalking. It tends to have a wider variety of behaviors. It's also important, again, to mention that folks who are stalking somebody are often using multiple tactics, multiple behaviors. They're doing multiple different things across a span of time. So it's typically not going to be just watching, right, or just following the survivor. They typically will have other behaviors like following and consistent texting and leaving gifts at the doorstep, for example. So the first one is surveillance. With surveillance, it's important to note that there may not be any actual contact with the survivor, or at least contact that the survivor is aware of. This is the information gathering part of stalking and can happen at any time during the cycle of behavior. Though we do often see this behavior at the beginning of the abuse. So this might look like a perpetrator following the survivor. It might be literally following them on foot, in a vehicle, on public transportation. But it also might be using things like social media to track their locations or to find where they're at, following in the like social media sphere. Stalkers might be utilizing cameras, GPS, and or other recording devices to continue to gather information. They might be using apps on cell phones or things like air tags that can be used to track the survivor on where they're at or listen on what the survivor is saying. The perpetrator might also be like waiting at different locations to see where the survivor might be. So if the perpetrator knows that survivor works at this location, they might be just kind of hanging outside that location and waiting to see the survivor show up. Again, they might be monitoring devices or online activity. So they might be, tracking like the geotagging that's happening on someone's social media. They might have downloaded an app on the survivor's phone if they had access to the phone physically, or put some people are really tech savvy, right? So they might be using different technology to monitor the devices or the online activity. Or it might also not be that tech savvy, and it might be that they have physical access to the phones or laptops and are able to go back and look at a survivor's history. So, especially when we're thinking about a current intimate partner who might still have access to survivors' devices. An abuser might also be getting information from other people. Oftentimes, this might seem innocent. Folks might be providing information to the perpetrator without realizing what's going on fully, right? So this might look like a stalker calling the survivor's mom and saying, "Hey, I haven't heard from them in a couple days. Is she at work?" Kind of thing. Might be calling the workplace and getting a most updated schedule or different things like that of just trying to get more information from other people, often under the guise of, I'm just out of caring, I'm just checking in on this person. One resource I want to highlight in this around air tags and things like that is that some communities and law enforcement might be able to like check through someone's vehicle, for example, if a survivor has concerns that they are being stalked or tracked by their abuser via their vehicle and are concerned that something like an air tag or a tile is in their car, sometimes law enforcement is able to go through and like scan for it and potentially remove it. Similarly, Les Schwab also can do this. And I believe across communities in Oregon, it's a free service. Les Schwab can't remove the air tag, but they can kind of like find it and let the survivor know where it's at. The next bucket of behavior is life invasion. This might, especially, currently, might look a lot like unwanted, persistent messaging, texting, emailing, or calling. So using that technology to continually invade that survivor's life um, and let them continue communicating. This has, and for a lot of folks, has replaced like what we might have seen historically as like physical letters that perpetrators might have been sending. But now we're seeing a lot of times that survivors are getting hundreds of text messages, dozens of phone calls in just a very short period of time. And I want to encourage everyone to really think about how invasive that would feel on your life if someone was continually texting and calling you. I think it's very easy for us to minimize how invasive and how impactful persistent texting and calling may be on someone's phone because, hypothetically, we can just turn it off, right? But our phones are something that we all use as tools every day to stay connected to loved ones, for work, for school. And that significantly is invading someone's life. They can't just walk away from their phone oftentimes. Again, a stalker might be showing up where the survivor is or where they might be. They might be sabotaging different pieces while showing up to where the survivor is at. And they might be leaving gifts, packages, letters, or notes at survivor's home or work. So to be clear, there's just different ways that a stalker might be invading in someone's life. And when we're thinking about things as far as safety planning around it, particularly around phone calls and text messages and things, it might be, it's always going to be worth having a good conversation about the pros and cons of, for instance, blocking a perpetrator. So if we're talking to a survivor and part of their experience with stalking is that the abuser is continually sending text messages or phone calls, it might be, really logical to block the perpetrator, and that might work well. But for some perpetrators, this may even escalate the behavior. So we just want to point out that this is not blaming the survivor for the escalation if they choose to block the perpetrator, but we simply want to point out the difference between what some people may have experienced or seen when they were younger versus now. The next bucket of behavior is intimidation. So this is very similar to what we might see in domestic violence, for example. A perpetrator might have verbal, written, or online threats that they are sending to the victim or the survivor. They might be sending third parties to watch or threaten, particularly when offenders are incarcerated. I know I personally have seen this pop up for survivors where abuser is incarcerated and then all of a sudden this abuser's friends are popping up at work. And we don't really know if the third parties have like all of the information, if they know that stalking has happened, for example, but it's obviously used as a tool to continue that like sending the message to the survivor, like I'm still around, I'm still watching you. And so we can definitely see the engagement of third parties happening here. Abusers may also be threatening to hurt themselves, so intimidating the survivor into making a certain decision, saying, if you don't do X, I'm going to hurt myself. And so that to kind of obviously coerce the survivor into picking a certain decision. The last piece of this isn't property damage. This happens quite frequently with stalking. And what I have seen, a lot of times survivors are coming out from work or from working out or from school, and they're finding their tires are slashed or that they have a broken window in their car, or they have had the lock broken on their door at home. So that property damage can really be impactful. And especially, obviously, when we're thinking about finances and survivors being financially stable, obviously, property damage is expensive and it adds up. And it's also very clearly sending the message like, I'm still here, right? And the last bucket is interference. So this is sabotaging the survivor's relationships with or employment. It might be like spreading rumors about a survivor in their church environment or in their school. A lot of times, survivors are being stalked by current or former partners, or by folks who are in similar, social circles. And so, how damaging is it if a survivor is having rumors and things spread about them to the folks who they care about, to the folks that they're working with, by the perpetrator? The abuser might be causing situations that require time and or finances to address. So similarly, with the property damage, but they might be just causing a ruckus in survivors' lives that they then have to address, that takes time off of work, that takes money. And also a lot of times with property damage, this is something that like resources from like social services might be less likely to be able to support with replacing, for example. We might also have interference with custody agreements or exchanges. They might be, showing up early if they're like, if they are sharing children, showing up early or showing up to the wrong place or violating their agreement in a different way. Similarly, also, I've seen um, like if a stalker might like break into someone's house, which is similar to property damage, obviously. They might steal something from the survivor. They might just kind of trash the place, or they might just like move some things around to make the survivor again get that message of like, I was here and I'm still around, right? Um, so all of these kind of different buckets kind of make up the different variety of tactics or behaviors we might see from stalkers. So now that we've kind of covered a little bit about what stalking is as a big picture, we're going to move into how frequently this is happening. I'm going to show some statistics, but first I just want to note that a lot of the data we have is very gender specific. It follows the gender binary, and we want to recognize that um, that even though it is in the binary, we don't want to take away from the fact that folks who are in marginalized communities, particularly um, non-binary folks, trans folks, they are more likely to experience violence like stalking than cisgender folks, for example. And we also know that a lot of data around victimization of men, um, it can be really inaccurate. It's kind of generally accepted that a lot of men might be experiencing domestic and sexual violence or things like stalking, and are less likely to report or be forthcoming in research or surveys, even anonymous ones, because of the deeply ingrained stigma against men who experience these things. So we just want to hold that as we kind of look at these statistics, that while these statistics feel really large and feel like a lot of people are experiencing stalking, these numbers are even higher in different communities, and maybe even higher than what we're seeing being reported in these surveys and research. So approximately 13.5 million people in the United States per year are experiencing stalking. This has increased over time. So this data specifically, the 13.5 million, is from 2016, 2017, which is already a bit dated. Um, but this is significantly up from the 2011 data, which showed us that about 7.5 million people had experienced stalking. So just in the span of 5, 6 years, we go from 7.5 million to 13.5 million, which is a very large increase. When we break it up by women versus men, we see about 1 in 3 women are experiencing stalking at some point in the last year of this survey, and about 1 in 6 men are experiencing stalking. What we also know is that stalking can and often does overlap with other forms of violence. So frequently survivors of stalking have also experienced or are currently experiencing domestic violence, sexual violence, child or elder abuse, homicide, or hate or bias crimes. So we see this overlap of like if someone is experiencing stalking by an intimate partner, so that's stalking and domestic violence, they're at an increased risk for lethality, for homicide. And so we see that overlap. And we see an overlapping of perpetrators using different types of violence against one survivor, against multiple survivors. Um, and so there's just a really significant overlap. And so while today we are primarily focused on stalking, we can't talk about stalking without talking about the domestic and sexual violence and risk of homicide that survivors are often experiencing when experiencing stalking. So here are some numbers on to show how stalking and other forms of violence, specifically sexual violence, are overlapping and increasing the risk. So what this graphic is showing is for survivors who, intimate partners who are stalked experience higher rates of sexual violence than those who are not stalked. And so we see like about 1 in 3 women who are stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. And in this graphic, we kind of see that increase of if folks are experiencing stalking, they're at a higher risk of experiencing the other forms of violence and vice versa. I mean, it's also important to note that this sample was taken from women who have filed for restraining orders or protective orders. So we see increased risks of verbal pressure for sex, sexual degradation, sexual coercion, and other different forms of sexual violence that survivors are experiencing in combination with the stalking that they're experiencing. As I mentioned already, stalking is a risk factor for lethality. Overall, stalking increases the risk of intimate partner homicide by 3 times. We know that stalking can escalate really quickly, but it also might never escalate. But there is research showing that this increase of homicide, risk of homicide, happens when stalking is present. We don't have a ton of research on how escalation, happens with stalking, but some studies have shown that about a third of stalking situations eventually turn physical or sexually violent. So we're, again, seeing those overlaps. Overall, studies have shown that stalking behavior increases the risk of intimate partner homicide by 3 times, and some studies shown that it has increased risk of upward of 5 times. Specifically, these statistics are really reflecting the overlap of stalking and femicide, which is the murder of women. So we see, for some statistics on this overlap, about 74% of women murdered by an intimate partner were stalked first. About 85% of women who survived murder attempts were also stalked. 89% of femicide victims who had been physically assaulted before their murder were stalked in the year prior. 54% of femicide victims reported stalking to the police before their murder. So I really want to sit with those statistics for a moment. A lot of survivors are experiencing sexual violence, physical violence, and stalking. And when those things are present, their risk for homicide is increased. And what we're seeing in this data also is that a lot of survivors are reporting their experience with stalking to law enforcement, and they still, in this study, still resulted in murder. And while the response to stalking has changed over the years by law enforcement, stalking is still a very challenging crime for folks to prosecute, for folks to investigate. And for a long time, stalking laws just weren't equipped to respond to this type of violence. And so I just really want to hold that when we're working with survivors, and if they have an interest in reporting, we can support them. And they frequently might not get the result that they're wanting from law enforcement and from prosecution that they're wanting, which is, we see that across different forms of gender-based violence. Similarly to other forms of violence as well, we do see that the average age at first incident of stalking for most survivors are under the age of 25. This, is similar to other forms of violence. And we do see actually a lot of the stalking happens for folks under the age of 25. About 59% of folks experiencing stalking were under the age of 25. Another example of overlap in stalking and other forms of violence is that 16% of 18 to 24-year-old stalking victims reported that the stalker shared nude, semi-nude, or sexually explicit photos or videos of them. So we're really seeing, particularly with our younger populations, that the use of sabotage around sharing sexually explicit materials may be present for them in that, and how that is impacting their lives. We also know that folks in the queer community are more likely to experience stalking as well. And we can see the disparities in this image by women, about 1 in 3 versus 1 in 6 straight women. 1 in 14 men are experiencing stalking compared to 1 in 20 straight men. For lesbian and gay women, about 1 in 5, 1 in 9 men, compared to those numbers for straight folks. So we're seeing much higher numbers for folks in the queer community. And while I don't have the statistics on the screen, we know that folks who are trans are experiencing even higher rates of gender-based violence, things like stalking, domestic violence, sexual assault, compared to cisgender folks. So at even higher rates, more disproportionately experiencing those violences. Similarly, we see that with folks in the BIPOC community. So we see the numbers on the left are the percentages that women of color are experiencing stalking at some point in their lifetimes. So specifically, multiracial women, about 54% of them are experiencing stalking at some point in their lifetime, compared to 33% of white women. 42% of Native American, American Indian or Alaska Native women are experiencing stalking, 30% of Black women, 26% of Latina women, and 24% of Asian or Pacific Islander women. So the comparison we see, as with other forms of violence, is when folks are marginalized or experiencing oppression, they're at a disproportionate risk of experiencing violence. We see the same thing for men. About 15% of white men are experiencing stalking, and that doubles for multiracial men. It nearly doubles for Alaska Native or American Indian men. We see that most offenders are using in-person and technology for stalking, so they're overlapping the different forms of behaviors. So we see about 66% are using unwanted phone calls, voicemails, or text messages. 55% are using emails or social media messages. 22% are spied on or monitored using technology. 14% are tracked location with electronic device or apps. So I think a lot of times too, I want to highlight when we think about stalking and a lot of the questions around current, tactics for stalking, we tend to really focus on the tracked location with an electronic device or app. So those Apple IDs, those tiles that might be getting placed in people's cars, for example. 14% is a super high number. And we're still seeing stalkers use other different forms of stalking at much higher rates. Like we're talking 66% of folks, majority of folks are getting unwanted phone calls and text messages. 55%, majority of folks are getting unwanted emails and social media messages. So I do want to challenge folks to think about what the first image that comes to mind when you hear the word stalker. I think for majority of us who have been raised in this society, probably think about perpetrators looking something like this. You know, a man in a hood with binoculars in the bushes outside, looking into people's homes and things like that. Um, and I think when we are coming from a place where this is what we think of with perpetrators of stalking, it tends to come with the idea that they're usually strangers, that they're usually just some random person who just like saw somebody and they're like stuck on it. And that's kind of what we see reflected in media. But ultimately, what we know is that majority of stalkers are known to survivors. I don't think that's a surprise for most of us who are familiar with, the relationships that are common between survivors of sexual assault and the perpetrators. 44% of stalking victims are stalked by a current or former intimate partner. 37% are stalked by an acquaintance. And then 19% are stalked by a stranger, which for me, 19% still seems really high. But I really want to highlight that that's still, nearly 80% are intimate partners or acquaintances. We also have about 9% are family members, 7% are brief encounters, 4% are persons of authority. I also want to acknowledge that these numbers do go over 100%, and that's because a lot of survivors who reported to this study had experienced stalking by multiple people. So that's why it's over 100%. On average, the intimate partner stalkers, so current or former, pose the greatest threats to their victims. I think there's a lot of reasons why this might happen. But really, if we think about the amount of information that a current or former partner has about us, they know where we go to school, where we go to work, they know our routine, our regular visited locations where we work out, they know family members, friends, acquaintances. They know a lot of information about us. They might even know social media passwords or passwords to our phones, things like that is might be normally gathered information in the course of someone's relationship. And a person who has the intention to cause harm can use all of that information to further that harm against the survivor, right? Also, people in a survivor's life tend to know their current or former partners and may not know about the situation, so they may be more likely to talk to the perpetrator or share information with them. They may have access to survivor's home, so like they might have, keys to their house, or know where the spare key is outside. They might have access to their car. They might know where their phone is, their social media accounts, their email. Might be able to access all those things and be able to monitor the activity that folks are having on those, and have easier access to do that than, say, an acquaintance, for example. Additionally, it might be more dismissed. The behavior of stalking might be more dismissed by others because of the pre-existing relationship. And I think especially in my experience when I've talked to young people, it's very common for folks to like share locations and for them to kind of check in on where they're at and things like that. And if we're in a culture where it's very normalized for folks to kind of continually know where we are, it's that much harder for survivors when they're like, actually, no, this is really scary for me, to be taken seriously by friends, family, or service providers. Survivors also might be less likely to reach out for help due to their relationship with the perpetrator. Might have genuine love for the perpetrator. They might not want them to get in trouble. Might think that others won't believe them or not see it as abusive behavior. So there's a lot of stigma that is in place for survivors of any kind of intimate partner violence or any kind of gender-based violence. And that can certainly act as a barrier for survivors to seek support from folks like law enforcement and service providers. In that, we've seen a lot of the normalization of stalking that has happened in our community, in our society, large and small. We can see how prevalent stalking is based on all the statistics we just went over, but it's still often treated like it isn't that big of a deal, especially when we compare to our understandings of things like sexual violence. Sometimes we dismiss the experience of stalking by using phrases like, oh, they're just a little weird, or they're harmless, or we might even like romanticize it and say they're just being romantic, that they're like pursuing you over and over again, right? Intentionally or not, by using these kinds of terms and phrases, we're communicating that stalking behavior is not as severe as it really can be. And when we, reflect back on the statistics of the risk of homicide, people are being stalked and then being murdered. I've heard people talk about stalking is murder in slow motion. Um, and when we compare that to the way we see it talked about in media, it's really disconnected. We're really dismissing all of these forms of behaviors. When we are dismissing this and minimizing violence, it can easily lead survivors to not getting the support and resources they need from their community, the justice system, medical providers, etc. It also can lead to our policies, practices, and legal expectations not reflecting the seriousness of this, which we have seen historically. So, like, as an example of the way we also just use stalking, like the literal word stalking, in a way that normalizes or minimizes the behavior. I mean, I think we've all probably heard this, like, I was stalking you on socials last night. And that wasn't stalking, right? That was just looking at someone's social media. So if we want to break down how stalking is often portrayed in media, we kind of see these four different tropes that pop up: romantic, funny, heroic, and edgy. So I'm going to break this down a little bit. So the first one we're going to talk about is romantic. So on the left, we have a screen grab from the Say Anything movie that came out in the 80s. John Cusack's character, the man in the picture, is, if you haven't seen the movie, he is dating Diane. She breaks up with him. And what the audience knows is that Diane broke up with him at the urging of her father, who has become concerned about the closeness of their relationship. However, Diane doesn't tell Lloyd this. She just tells him that she wants to concentrate on her studies and stop seeing him. Lloyd's sister tells him to, quote, be a man in order to win her back. He shows up outside Diane's house, blasting In Your Eyes by Peter Gabriel, the song that was playing when they had sex for the first time. They end up getting back together at the end of the movie, and this is constantly cited as one of the most romantic moments in cinematic history. However, we know that that is not that romantic. If we look at this through the lens of stalking behavior, there's a lot wrong with this. Lloyd completely disregarded Diane's words. Remember, he didn't know that it was her dad encouraging her to break up. He just knew that she didn't want to be with him anymore. And then he shows up at her house without permission, uses a very emotional moment in their relationship to try to manipulate her back into the relationship. And also, the sister uses this toxic gender expectations to push Lloyd to disregard Diane's boundaries. So this is a really good example of how stalking behavior is not only dismissed, seen as not as a big deal, but also is seen as romantic. Our next example, with being kind of funny, also edgy, is You. So the portrayal of stalking in the media and not being accurate is not just a past issue of media, it's still very present. So this Netflix series came out only a few years ago, just came out with a new season. And on top of a lot of unhealthy behaviors, Joe, the main character here seen on the left, stalks two different women, multiple women now that more seasons are out, and ends up marrying and having a child with Love, the other main character on the screen. While the creator and many of the actors involved have denounced the stalking behavior and framed the show as things not to do or people to not get involved with, many viewers have romanticized Joe's behavior. He also used humor throughout the series to kind of provide like a humorous note to his behavior. For example, at one point, he broke into his first victim's house and was like standing in the shower, and she's getting ready and she doesn't know that he's in her shower. And he like She like turns on the water, doesn't even notice he's in there. And then his inner dialogue that you hear as the audience member is like, oh, romantic guys are always getting into trouble like this, or something to that extent. So we really hear this like funny piece. And then we also had this really strong romanticization of Joe's behavior from viewers. So we saw things on social media talking about how attractive Joe, the character, is, um, and talking about how he's just in love with her. And if we just like watch the show, he's not that creepy, he's in love, things like that. Some other examples, the heroic trope, we see oftentimes in things like superhero movies. So one example is Spider-Man. He was stalking Mary Jane, like watching her from afar. He was like standing on buildings, like watching her. And it's portrayed to like as this idea of making sure she's safe and that she's okay. But really he's watching her from afar, which is surveillance. Similarly to romanticizing stalking behaviors in media, we sometimes see media being edgy, and using stalking behaviors to be like sexy or tantalizing. One show that comes to mind, I mean, You definitely has pieces of this as well. But in Twilight, like Edward was showing up in Bella's room, and he also was like saving her from a bunch of people who were harassing her. So these like pieces of like heroicism and like edginess and romance all kind of coming together, and behaviors that was like really unannounced and like non-consensual contact. Ultimately, we know that in reality, stalking is a very scary form of violence for someone to experience. And with media consistently downplaying the seriousness of stalking through these different tropes, it can act as further a barrier for survivors and for service providers to identify what's happening as stalking and to respond in like the most efficient way. The media goes far more past just movies and TV shows. We hear this in music. All of these examples are a little bit older, but we have folks saying things like, I'm going to get you, I'm going to find you, I'll be there watching you, I'll watch you through a window and stare at you. These things as we're reading sound really creepy, but are really just like normal sounding music that lots of folks listen to. Um, and so we can absolutely see some problems here. To be clear, I don't want to demonize media. We all consume media all of the time. And I have personally watched these shows and listened to these songs. So I'm absolutely not sitting here saying don't watch these shows. There's ethical consumption, of us just being thoughtful about the different nuances that are popping up in these different forms of media. I'm not trying to demonize media. I'm just saying that we should begin to take into consideration how the words and actions we see are normalized within the media that we consume and its impacts on what we consider to be normal words and actions in our real life experiences. Really just wanting to have some awareness and thoughtful consumption rather than no consumption at all. So to kind of think through the scenario a little bit that I'm gonna walk you guys through. You get an early morning call from a friend. She is crying and struggling to speak on the other end. When she calms down, she says, there's a cup of coffee in my car. Your friend was previously stalked by an ex-partner and recently relocated. She did not believe that her ex, who had also physically abused her in the past, knew where she was. When your friend left for work this morning, there was a cup of coffee in her car with the pet name her ex used for her written on it. So obviously, if we kind of put yourself in the shoes of this, we might on the surface just be hearing like, oh, there's a coffee cup in your car. If, for example, this person was to call law enforcement and law enforcement didn't have this other context of previous abuse and the pet name specifically, they just might hear someone who's really distressed about a coffee cup ending up in her car. But what we know based on the context is that there's a previous history of abuse. She's relocated, meaning, she obviously, what I'm hearing from this is that she's feeling a lot of fear. There's a history of physical violence, and the stalker is using something that is like emotionally connected and emotionally charged, the pet name, to kind of leave this message of like, I know where you're at, I'm here, I'm watching you, right? Which is deeply scary and deeply unsettling. And if we didn't have all of this other context and information, we might not realize what's going on. So we might want to ask some questions if we're hearing just this very standard, like, there's a coffee cup in my car, asking survivors, like, and why does that worry you? And what is feeling upsetting about that? Things like that that might help us get some more information if that's not readily available to us. So moving on to some of the impacts that survivors might experience. There's a lot of different things that folks may experience. So we know that about 86% report substantial personality changes. 37% of survivors fulfill all criteria for PTSD. About a quarter of folks consider death by suicide. 14% relocate because of the stalking. So really, here I want to highlight considering the financial implications of this as well. We're amidst, a housing crisis, and folks, it costs like a lot of money and time and stress to relocate, potential loss of like support networks, things like that. So it is a really big deal to have folks being relocating, and lots of folks are relocating multiple times. Continuing on the note of financial implications, we know that about 13% of stalking survivors are losing work days, with about 50% of those losing 5 or more days. Overall, and similar to other forms of intimate partner violence or gender-based violence, we know that survivors of stalking experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, insomnia, and have relationship complications. So thinking about some of those impacts I just went over, and again, those weren't all inclusive, and folks may experience some or a combination or all of those as potential impacts from experiencing stalking. I'm going to walk you all through a story about Alice Ruggles. So I have the timeline here on the screen. So just as like a content warning, as I walk through this story, it does end with Alice being murdered by her stalker. And so as I walk through this, please feel free to pause and step away or fast forward. But with all of those things in mind of the previous behaviors, the normalization, the impacts that we've talked about, I want you to think about those as I walk through this story. So Alice Ruggles was a young woman who was being stalked by an ex-partner named Tryman. She met Tryman and as the partner and later to be stalker in October of 2015. She became in a relationship with him. Her family thought of Tryman as polite and kind. And eventually throughout her relationship with him, the family noticed that she began to withdraw from her friends and family. She lost weight, lost some self-confidence. They noticed that Tryman was requiring her to be in constant contact with him and had other controlling behaviors like choosing what she could wear. Just a few months after getting together, in August of 2016, they broke up. After the breakup, the behavior moved more into stalking behaviors. She believed that he had put spyware on her phone and was talking to her friends and family about removing the spyware from her phone. One day, he showed up at her house unannounced, and when she opened the curtains to look at him, she found Tryman setting flowers and chocolates down on her porch and then backing away with his hands up in the air. After this, on October 1st, 2016, Alice first reported the stalking to law enforcement. They issued what was called a PIN in this country, but was essentially a restraining order. And after the restraining order was put in place, she received another phone call from Truman. And in that, he was sending multiple messages and phone calls, despite being asked not to contact her. During that initial report to law enforcement, she also mentioned that he had hacked into her phone and social media accounts. After the restraining order or PIN was given out, he left a voicemail for Alice saying repeatedly that he wasn't going to kill her, and why does he think that he would kill her? She reported the violation to law enforcement, and then on October 12th, Tryman broke into Alice's house and murdered her. Her family later found out that Tryman had multiple incidences of violence in his history, including past restraining orders, and they eventually started a campaign to create a registry for those who had restraining orders and committed these forms of violence. And Tryman was sentenced to life in prison. So please take a moment to take care of yourself. This is a true story that happened to Alice, and there is a video that I will have linked somewhere. And in that video, it does go through more of the detail of what I just went through, including 911 calls of her roommate finding her. In this, we can see a lot of the behaviors and impacts on Alice and the behaviors of Tryman that we've already discussed. So Alice's family saw lots of signs that Alice was experiencing stalking and experiencing abuse when they were still together. They noted that she had low self-confidence, that she was withdrawing from her social connections. She was literally losing weight. And then they also were witnessing some of the controlling behaviors. Like they knew that he was dictating what she could wear. When we think about how some stalking behaviors are scary because of the context, like when he dropped off the flowers and chocolate on her porch, that in and of itself is not illegal, and in a healthy context might not be scary or upsetting. But with the context of her saying she didn't want to have contact with him, them already broken up, a previous history of abuse, to be leaving that, and then he was minimizing his behaviors by putting up his hands and walking away. Like, I'm not here as a threat to you, right? But we know, obviously, he was a threat to her. So throughout, he was minimizing and trivializing his behaviors through putting his hands up and acting kind of sends the message, what's the big deal? And also in his phone call and voicemail of I'm not going to kill you, over and over and over again, saying in the negative, I'm not going to kill you. And that was only days after it was only days later that he ended up murdering her. I also want to note that this example had a really pretty quick escalation. So they only knew each other for a year and 2 months. So they got into a relationship in October of a whole year. October of 2015, it was October of 2016 that she was murdered. And it was only 2 months after the breakup that the murder happened. So that is a real life example of how we might see stalking escalate and some of the behaviors we might see. We're going to shift into some specific examples of resources and safety planning that we can go through with survivors when they're experiencing stalking. So first, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about workplace accommodations, then we'll go into the ACP program and some protective orders. So Oregon law, or ORS, has workplace accommodations for survivors who have experienced or are at risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. There's no requirement on individuals' length of employment or hours per week, and they can request accommodations and reasonable leave. So what this means is that survivors are protected from being fired from basically due to the violence that they had experienced. And they can request accommodations to respond to the violence that they're experiencing. So if a survivor is working at a business that has multiple locations, they can request that they transfer to a different location that the abuser doesn't know about. They can request a modified schedule or a new phone number. They can ask for a new desk placement, all of these things that may increase their safety in their workplace. They also can request reasonable leave. So leave for things like seeking legal assistance, medical treatment, counseling, or relocation. They can seek from their employer. In Oregon, we now have paid leave Oregon, which can, in some cases, help folks have paid leave. So they could take this reasonable leave from work without fear of losing their job. And then paid leave Oregon can help compensate for some of that leave if it's unpaid. So something we can do as advocates is that we can let folks know that this may be an option for them, and help them talk through how they could talk to their employers about this. Something that might be helpful for survivors of stalking is the Address Confidentiality Program. This is a statewide program that's ran by the Oregon Department of the Criminal Justice. And basically, it is a mail forwarding service for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking, or stalking. And it provides a substitute address for survivors to provide to people that they are needing to have mail sent to from. So it can be used for first class mail, license, or ID card. It can be used for child support, marriage license, enrolling dependents in public school. It can be used, the substitute address can be used for a majority of things that survivors are needing to provide an address for. The primary exceptions that I can recall off the top of my head is for packages, like if they're ordering from Amazon or something like that, they can't send it to the ACP address. And if they for like utilities and things like that, because obviously like utilities would need to know your literal location, right? The address confidentiality program, folks who are in victim services can apply to be an ACP applicant, basically. So applicant assistant, I think is the title. So advocates can be an applicant assistant and then can fill out the ACP applications for survivors with them, so that they can be approved for the ACP program. The next resource that can be helpful potentially for survivors is a stalking protective order. Oregon has 4 primary protective orders, and one of them is specific to stalking. There's a few basic requirements for folks to qualify for a stalking protective order. So there needs to be repeated and unwanted contact, at least 2 incidences in the last 2 years. The respondent, which is the perpetrator, and the petitioner, which is the victim, can be over or under 18. And there has to be reasonable fear for physical safety. There is an extra step in stalking protective orders compared to other protective orders that we have in Oregon. So the first step is folks file for a temporary order. So this is, survivor fills out paperwork, and within about 24 hours, they see the judge, 24 like business day hours. They see the judge and they grant or dismiss a temporary order. The judge finds probable cause that the respondent, which is the perpetrator again, has committed stalking. The hearing is scheduled for a final order. So in other protective orders, the final order hearing is basically like a contestment. So the respondent has to opt into a contestment, where this is automatically scheduled because stalking protective orders can last a lifetime. So they just automatically have a final hearing. The temporary order lasts until the hearing, and the judge may extend the temporary order for up to 30 days at the final hearing. At the permanent or final order hearing, the judge finds it more likely than not that the respondent has committed stalking, and then it doesn't expire unless there's an end date specifically included, so it lasts for life. Of course, at either date, at either hearing, a judge could dismiss it, but there's kind of this like temporary order time, and then there's the permanent order that happens later. The temporary order prohibits folks from contacting, attempting to contact, or stalking. The final order does all of that, plus may require a mental health evaluation and treatment of the perpetrator, and may prohibit them from having firearms and ammunition. It's important to know when we're talking to survivors about stalking protective orders is that at the final hearing, the perpetrator is made aware of that hearing and is invited to attend that hearing and provide evidence or their able to make their case that they don't want the stalking order in place. So when we're talking about safety planning with survivors, we really want to be intentional about giving them the information of what these hearings look like, safety planning, going in and out of the courthouse if they're concerned about being in the same space as the perpetrator, thinking about, what information, if any information that's being put in the protective order is new for the perpetrator, how do we kind of want to think about that? So really talking through all these pieces with survivors is really important. Some of the other things we might talk to survivors about doing is documenting or keeping an incident or behavior log. This puts a lot of responsibility and burden on survivors, and I don't want to dismiss that. When it comes to stalking, often, as we saw in Alice's story, a lot of the responsibility to track what has happened to them is placed on the victim or on the survivor. And this is exhausting and time consuming, and I want to recognize that. And if a survivor has an interest in reporting to law enforcement or filing a restraining order, having a log can be helpful. So they're not having to go back and try to remember all the things that happened. And it can help kind of bolster their what they're saying for folks. So this might look like including date and time, what happened, where it happened, if there were witnesses to the behavior, if there's any evidence. So, is there photos of the car tires being slashed, or, if they're physically assaulted, is there pictures of injuries, things like that? Are there screenshots of all of the text messages that were sent to them? And if they made a report specific to that incident, they can track the who they reported to, and even information about the officer. This is a resource from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, SPARC, stalkingawareness.org, which is where a lot of this content is pulled. Highly would recommend checking out their website to pull more resources, additional training opportunities from them. And they have these logs on there, easy to print off and things like that. Some other things that we can talk through with survivors or potentially be able to offer them is we can talk to them about varying their routes and routines. Again, I want to honor that a lot of these are putting responsibility on survivors to change their lives, and that is tough. But some of these things might be able to increase some safety or feelings of safety for the survivor. So varying routes and routines might look like changing how they drive to work, or maybe they're taking a different route on public transportation. Or maybe instead of going to the gym on Tuesdays, they're going on Thursdays some days, some weeks. Just changing up the different routines. And we can talk through with survivors of where are they most concerned about seeing the perpetrator? Where is the perpetrator popping up at? And then we can focus on those. I really want to encourage when we're talking about enhancing security measures or safety planning with survivors that we're really letting survivors take the lead. They're the experts in their own lives, and we can ask them what they're needing, what they're most concerned about, and we can go from there. Some survivors might feel more comfortable taking a self-defense course. I think a lot of times this might, help folks have increased feeling of security or confidence and being able to go living throughout their life. And so this might be something to help make survivors feel more empowered. We could ask a landlord to remove name from tenant list on the building if this is something. I know some buildings still have little call boxes or lists of tenants, but they're first initial, last name kind of thing, so they can buzz in. So we could talk to their landlord about removing their name from that. We can talk about parking in well-lit areas, installing alarm systems or security cameras. Sometimes domestic violence agencies or other service providers are able to provide security cameras. So I'm thinking the cameras that go on doorways, doorbells, things like that can help just increase that security. And even though, again, like we know a security camera isn't going to stop violence from happening, but it can be a way to essentially document ongoing violence that's happening, and it may um, deter someone from returning to that location, right? We can talk to survivors about changing their locks. Sometimes landlords are able to change their locks for like a low price. Um, Sometimes they're able to purchase locks and change it themselves, or service providers are able to purchase the locks and have them be changed. Um, this could be for doors, safes, windows, gates, things like that. I will say that landlords, if survivors are changing their locks on like a rental house, they're going to need to provide their landlord a new key. Um, but that could be something that might be helpful for survivors. We can talk about changing passwords on all their accounts. So Facebook, Instagram, banking accounts, on their cell phone, on their email. And this is a huge ask for a lot of folks. Um, we have a lot of accounts. It's hard to go through all of them. And where an advocate can play a role is maybe just like sitting down and thinking about where it might be, a good starting point. For some folks might be like, let's change your iCloud account first, right? Accounts that might be connected to abuser, for example. We might be able to talk about blocking accounts or numbers. So again, weighing that like pros and cons list with survivors about what it might look like to block those accounts or not, or like phone numbers from the perpetrator, because we know that it might escalate the behavior. Some survivors might find it helpful to still have that contact with abusive person because at least they kind of keep tabs on them in a way. And so that might not feel really helpful to block the account or a phone number, but it might feel helpful. We can check social media privacy settings, see what's available. A lot of different apps, different social media has varying levels of privacy. So you might, even if you're like not friends or not following somebody, they might still be able to see all of your content. So we can change that to make it so it's more private. Or survivors might opt to just have new accounts or remove their accounts. And again, we can check for those tracking devices if that's the concern. We can lean in on our community and talk to survivors about who in their community they can trust and who can help them with their experiences. A lot of times, as we know, with the experiences of any of these forms of violence, whether it be domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or trafficking, we know that these forms of violences thrive in isolation. We know that abusers keep the survivors in isolation from their support network. We know that the stigma isolates survivors. And so if we as advocates can encourage survivors to expand their community, to connect with family and friends who they trust, if they can connect to other service providers, that we are helping survivors get out of that isolated place, which is going to help them heal and move forward and all of those things. So we might talk to survivors about keeping a trusted person updated. What's happening? Where are you? Things like that. Especially in those times that we might be seeing some escalation happening. This could be a service provider, could be a hotline, could be a friend, family member, really whoever the survivor is identifying as a trusted person. We can talk to the survivor about requesting that other people don't talk to the perpetrator or give them information. So a lot of times, again, as I mentioned earlier, perpetrators and survivors have similar social circles, especially if they are current or former intimate partners. And so talking with survivors about having those really tough conversations with family and friends about how, like, having the conversation of, hey, something's going on. I need you not to talk to this person. If they ask, I need you not to tell them my new phone number, et cetera, et cetera. And just really empowering the survivor to share what feels good for them, and not share what they don't have to. Survivors might be able to have a buddy system, or like for instance at work, like maybe they're able to get a someone to like walk them out to their car or walk them between classes, things like that that might be able to help with like a buddy system. Sometimes this can be a formal like accommodation. So for example, if a survivor is like a student at a college, they might be able to use a Title IX supportive measure to have accompaniment, to like walk them to their car, for example. They also might, we might want to talk to survivors about having a go bag, if they need to leave quickly, particularly if they're still, with the person who's stalking them. If it's a partner, how can we have a go bag to quickly relocate or quickly leave if they need? And where should it be? Should it be with a friend in their trunk, what have you? Um, and also just really encouraging that they are connecting with advocacy agencies that are relevant to them. So that might be a culturally specific advocate agency, might be the local community-based domestic violence agency in their area. But really encouraging that advocates are here to help with safety planning. We're here to help connect to resources, help bounce ideas off of, right? And so, really encouraging the ongoing connection to advocates. If survivors aren't engaged with the advocate agency yet, helping them get connected and making that as easy as possible for them. But that is all I have for today. My contact information is on the screen. If folks have questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly. My name's Erin, and there's my email down at the bottom. And I really appreciate you all being here and listening to me talk. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.